Hi everyone. Um, so today I'd like to talk about the techniques and methods for doing ethnography. These are the tools that anthropologists use to be able to do their work, to collect their data. Now, anthropology is not just a series of anecdotes, oh, this happened to me or this happened to my friend. And we try to remain objective and scientific and build up a case for an argument that we make about cultures, societies, human behavior, rather than just one example being representative of everything. If you recall, I've talked in the past about the concepts of universals, that every human has has universal needs, desires that every human has: thirst, hunger, sex drive. All of these things are universals, but the way that you do it is cultural, and so each culture has specific particulars. Those particulars are the ways that each individual does things, but there's not an infinite number of general patterns that people adhere to. So this is really what anthropologists are trying to find, is we know what the universals are. We saw that biologically. We know where we come from. We know what kind of creatures we are, what kind of world we live in. But if we remain at particulars all the time, all we're doing is just describing one-off events. One thing happens and another thing happens and another thing happens. But what we're really trying to look for is patterns, these general patterns that humans can fit into. So for instance, if all humans have thirst, what kind of environment do you live in? Are you in an arid environment where water is scarce, or are you in a very wet environment where water needs to be managed and directed? So those particular behaviors might fit into general patterns. So in arid environment, arid adaptations on one side of the world, in the Gobi Desert, might be similar general patterns to cultures and their relationship to the universal of water, needing water, on the other side of the world. For instance, here in Nevada, in Las Vegas, where it's also an arid environment. Likewise, a place where water is abundant and needs to be managed, like the Pacific Northwest, is a rainforest. Is that similar to the kind of rainforest, wet environments that we get in a place like Amazonia? So it's these general patterns that we try to create, and these are negotiated amongst anthropologists. These are not necessarily things that are fixed. They're things that we need to build up an argument through collecting information on the particular behaviors of cultures and people around the world. So you're building towards that generality, and to do that you need some evidence. And to get that evidence, like I said, we need to be scientific and methodological. So ethnography is differentiated from ethnology in the sense that an ethnography is just the raw data collection of a culture that's observed by an anthropologist. So it's a description of a culture, essentially. And ethnology is comparative. So an ethnology is the use of ethnographies to try and generate some kind of a general pattern. So you look at one culture and you say, here is how they behave, and you look at another culture and you say, this is how they behave. Are they similar? What are the differences? Can we come up with a general pattern? That's what so an ethnology uses ethnography to try and come up with these patterns of human behavior. Now, when you're doing anthropological work, the first thing is you need to be safe, not just for yourself, but for the people that you are studying. Anthropology has, in its distant past, a history of treating people as objects. And although we're trying to be objective, we're not trying to objectify people. People have rights, and they have the right to be able to pick and choose whether you study them. They're not our experiments to work on. So ethics are the first thing that you need to take into account. Safety is a very important part of ethics. Are you safe in doing this? And so I don't encourage you, as in an Anthropology 101 course, to try and approach a dangerous group. But as you might imagine, anthropologists do like to study some of these groups. It's useful information to understand, for instance, whether a terrorist group has certain behavioral features that we could understand that can actually have some applications that could be used by us to try and improve situations. So terrorists are a culture or a subculture, but I would not recommend you to go into their community and say, hey, I'd like to study you, I'm an anthropologist. That probably isn't going to go down very well. So there are ways that you can approach difficult situations by professionals that you always have to be thinking about your safety. Also, if you use an informant, you don't want to put that person at risk. You don't want to commit any crimes. You don't want to cause any social repercussions for people as well. Some people may react badly to anthropologists, but even if they individually don't, others might look unfavorably upon that person's participation in anthropological study. So this is something you can get more information from professional websites like American Anthropological Association. They have guidelines for ethics and the proper way to do things. The most important thing to remember is what we call informed consent. So informed consent is just simply alerting the person that you're studying that you are studying them. Now, this is going to change their behavior. There's no question about that. But we owe it to them. They're a person with rights, and you need to respect those rights. So if you are conducting any sort of ethnographic study, you need to, if you're a professional, you need to get signed consent forms. You need to get institutional review board from an academic institution or some kind of institution to sign off that what you're doing is ethical. For your purposes, if you're doing an ethnography in an introductory fashion, you just need to inform the people that you're studying and let them be aware that you're studying them. When you start to do your ethnography, once you've dealt with the ethical concerns, there are some techniques that you can employ that anthropologists employ that allow us to gather data that is that's useful for writing an ethnography and then using in an ethnology. So these techniques are, first of all, first-hand observation of behavior, including participant observation. I'm going to go through all of these again. 2, conversation, from daily chit-chat to prolonged interviews. 3, a genealogical method. 4, detailed work with key consultants or informants. 5, in-depth interviewing and often collection of life histories. 6, problem-oriented research. 7, longitudinal research. And 8, team research. So let's take these one by one. First, observation and participant observation. So I've talked before about the concepts of emic and etic. Emic is an insider's view of a culture. So a participant, someone who is part of a culture, how they see certain elements of that culture hanging together. So what does a flag mean? Well, it means something to that individual, and that's part of their individual life history and their own association with it. They may dislike a flag. They may love a flag. They may want to give their life for a flag, or somewhere in between. That's their own emic perspective. your job as an anthropologist is to try and understand that emic perspective, but it's not your job to actually adopt that emic perspective. You need the etic perspective, which is the outsider's view, the view that objectively looks at behavior and describes it in a way that has meaning for anthropology. So observation, you can just observe as an outsider and collect data that is etic. And that may be good enough to understand the emic perspective. But you may actually need to involve yourself in certain types of cultural practices. So you may be required to participate in the culture that you're studying. Now, again, ethics is part of this. Make sure that the culture that you're observing allows you to and is happy with that. It's not offensive. So for instance, something like if you wanted to study festival culture, it might be interesting to attend the festival to see what people are interested in about it. It may affect your emic perspective, but you still want to describe it as an outsider, as from an etic perspective, using standardized terminology that all anthropologists can understand. So observation is one thing, but it also helps to be able to get information from participants as well directly through things like conversation, interviews, and you can even do things like this can be in depth, so a long conversation with someone on a range of subjects. Or it can be just superficial information that you standardize and ask multiple people about, and similar to doing a survey. Surveys are actually one method of getting this sort of information, where you can actually canvass large groups of people all at once. You can send out 100 forms and have people fill out those, and they all answer the same questions in maybe slightly different ways, and then you have some objective data to be able to base your interpretations upon. Also, you may want to have interviews at particular time periods. So schedules, interview schedules can be important, once again using this idea of festival culture. Maybe you want to interview people at the start of or before the festival, and then at the start, and then during the process of having a festival, and then towards the end, and maybe afterwards. And you can then compare those that information from conversations with informants and you're comparing like with like. So you're not saying, "Oh, I was so sick of it," with someone who's just starting out. You want to actually compare like with like, so you get some accurate data to work with. The typical way of that a lot of people think of when they think of a cultural anthropologist is some Western scientist going into some indigenous culture and taking notes on them. And while that does happen, that doesn't have to be the case anymore. Anthropology has turned a mirror on itself, in fact, and looks at the culture of anthropologists. But going for a moment with that traditional, typical view of an anthropologist, if you were to walk in as someone looking like myself into some village in Indonesia that wasn't used to seeing people like myself, what would be the first thing that I would do? Well, I would make friends with people as best as I could, and I would try and find out, and in fact people would introduce themselves to me, and maybe even introduce, here's my mother and my father, here's my brother and my sister, here are my children, here's my cousin. Those people aren't related to me at all, but they're my friends. This is what we call the genealogical method. And this is trying to create relationships between people in communities by establishing what those relationships are. So things like kinship ties is important. Descent, marriage, family groupings, social organizational principles, things like that. But this can also be scaled to other types of cultures that aren't just me walking into some Indonesian village. It could be something like a corporate structure. So what's the flow chart? How are people organized in that kind of a culture? Is it very top down? Is the leader have the final say, or is it more heterogeneous? Is it spread out, and is it a flattened sort of a rather than a hierarchy, a heterarchy? So trying to figure out the organizational principles of that culture, we call a genealogical method, but it can be used not necessarily just for blood relationships, but also social relationships as well, and that's really important. So how do you get that information? Well, this is another method, is finding key cultural consultants, key informants. We call them informants. You can keep them anonymous sometimes if you're writing a report, or you can name them if they allow you to do that. And this is where you isolate particular individuals. You find people that have certain experiences, talents, training, or are particularly knowledgeable about in certain aspects of this culture. And then they can provide you with some of the most complete and helpful information on what you're looking at. But you also need to keep in mind that these people only have their own perspective. So if you go and go and interview a mayor of a town, that mayor is going to have a lot of detailed information about the way the city runs, but it's only from the perspective of the top down, right? That mayor is going to be in charge of a lot of things. How do the people that are at the receiving end of these policies feel about them? Is it going to be the same thing? And so the academic perspective of a mayor is going to be one, and the emic perspective of a citizen is going to be another. So you may want to have more than one key informant for, or key consultant for gathering in-depth information. You also might benefit, especially with these key informants, by finding out life histories. And so when you start to interview people, it may be important to get people's, understand their emic perspective. What's their life history like? You might even record them, video them, or transcribe what they're saying. Obviously, if they're speaking another language, you're going to have to understand that. But it can reveal to you how these people that you're interviewing perceive, react to, and contribute to the aspects and elements of the culture that you're trying to record. The way that you approach an ethnography is can be just a generalized, I want to understand this, and you come in and describe it, but that's a pretty big task. So it might be, especially for cultures that are complex or have a lot of people, participants in them, like for instance, if I were to ask you to do an ethnography of America, that would be just too big for one person to do. We'll come back to team research in a moment. But what you might want to do is actually focus on a particular problem. That maybe you're interested in gaming culture. Online gaming communities have each game, in fact, has its own unique culture. And maybe you're interested, maybe that's too big. Maybe you are interested in how gender is perceived and understood in these gaming communities, and that would be what we call problem-oriented ethnography. And so you're interested in gender and how it is dealt with in a gaming community. That way you limit what you're trying to describe to a certain set of problems, and you gather information that helps you to understand those particular problems. This, of course, needs to be understood in a more holistic way. Anthropology is considered a holistic methodology for studying humans. So even though you have a problem-oriented approach to gathering ethnographic data, you'll want to actually bring that back into your understanding of that culture in general. And so that problem is part of a larger culture. And once again, we talk about things like cultural relativism. that particular problem can only really be understood in the context of the culture as it exists. So another thing that might be helpful is longitudinal research. Longitudinal research is long-term study of a community, region, society, culture, usually based on repeated visits to that place or repeated interviews. Now, for the purposes of a course like Anthropology 101, obviously you're not going to be going to a community in Brazil and then 10 years later you go and revisit that community, and 10 years later you do it again and again and again for your whole career. That's what longitudinal research tends to be amongst professional anthropologists, that they're actually trying to see changes through time. You can see that things like key informants change. So what was once maybe a child that you interviewed in your first visit could become an adult and maybe an elder or a mayor or some position of authority, or maybe they never got there. And so their position and their emic perspective is going to change, and that can be useful as well. So it's not just a snapshot of culture, it's changed through time, and that's really useful as well. And then finally, all of these things can be brought together in team research, that no anthropologist does everything on their own. Human culture, human society, human behavior is not reducible to just, okay, I've done it, that's it, I've nailed it, I've got humans now, and I understand them. That's not really possible. But each piece of the puzzle fits together like a mosaic, and so all of these ethnographies, all of these longitudinal studies, all of these problem-oriented approaches, all of these interviews can be brought together to create a mosaic that you can sort of squint your eyes and look at, and the picture becomes clearer when you bring them together. So if you have a particular community that you're interested in studying, you can have team members study different aspects. So if you have a biological anthropologist, you may look at their medical side of that anthropology. If you have someone who's an archaeologist or a historian, you might look at the history of where that culture came to be. If you have someone who is interested in art or religion or gender or any of these aspects of culture, those can all be contributing to the team research that brings it all together. And that way you don't have to do it all yourself, you don't have to do it all at once, and you can focus on what is most interesting to you and what you do best. And so these all are brought together into what we call ethnography.